a good unite? All right. All right. So today I'm going to be talking to you about the animation rigging package. I've been having a lot of fun playing with it. It's been really cool. There's a lot of cool possibilities. A bit about myself. I'm Teck. I'm a field engineer at Unity Singapore. Been here for about almost a year now. This presentation was done, well, a lot of the work was done by Dave Hunt in Copenhagen. He's a tech artist. And he's been driving a lot of the animation rigging stuff. So the animation rigging package, we introduced it in, I believe it was 19.1. And we've been improving it since. So it comes as a package in the package manager. Just grab it from the package manager, and we've got a bit of a roadmap here. In 19.2, we added keyframing in the animation window, so you can preview, you can add keyframes to all your constraints. And in 19.3, we're adding the ability to basically run the constraints in the timeline. So that really allows a lot of authoring layered animations with these constraints. So, as mentioned, this comes as a package. It also comes with, so you got documentation links. It's fairly comprehensive. And we have samples packaged right in the package manager window. So that'll give you a handful of samples that go through all the different constraints that we ship with. So you got a blend constraint, which basically gives you like a configurable 0 to 100% between two or more, between two objects, both their positions and rotations. We have a chain IK, which is really cool. The sample we have is like a scorpion that just kind of goes up and uses its tail to do a sting on a moving target. And the damped constraint is pretty cool. This, as you can see, it kind of gives you can do like sort of like a snake or some kind of, physics-y kind of movement. So we've done stuff like this, sort of like this chain of things trailing along. Yanghai over in Copenhagen also did one that used the damp constraints to make it look like this big crane was being affected by physics. You got this big heavy thing, so it's kind of moving slowly, trying to catch up with your inputs. So for the rigs, right now if you look at a game object, skeletal object in Unity, you can take a look at the hierarchy and try to find the bones, but that's not really that great in terms of workflow-wise. So we added a bone renderer, and this lets you define what bones you want to draw. So you have these gizmos, and they're configurable. You got pyramid bones. You've got basically a line renderer and a box renderer. You can configure like the color, the size, as well as show local axes. So that makes it really easy to sort of see what your rig looks like, your skeleton looks like. But more importantly, you can pick. All these are pickable. So if you want to pick like your thigh bone, you can just click on that. So one thing that can be useful is setting up multiple bone renderers on the same rig, and this allows you to see, set up bones for your bone renderer for your hands, your fingers, one for like your twist corrections, and one for your body. So you can turn these on and off individually. So if you don't really want to clutter your scene with the finger bones, you can turn those off, and you can turn them back on when you need to work with them again. So these rigs basically start off at the top level with the rig builder, and this essentially lets you define or reference one or more rigs inside the hierarchy. And what's cool is you can use this. You can turn these rigs on and off at runtime. So you can just turn on or off your IK, your say like a look at. and you just add little rig layers. Now the cool thing about the rig layers is that they have their own weights. So you can gradually turn on like IK constraint on a hand, for example. So the way these things are set up is that you'll notice basically it's a fairly logical setup. We have your animated model, your animated skeleton with the skin mesh renderer. Then we've got one or more game objects that hold a rig component, and all of these rigs basically hold all your constraints. So that's maybe your IK targets, your IK hints for pointing the middle bone. And the cool thing is that because these constraints and these rigs evaluate essentially top to bottom, it's really easy for an artist or a TA to tweak how they work. So if something's not working correctly, you can reorder them, and this changes the order of execution of these rigs and constraints. So as mentioned, each of these rigs has a weight property. So if you wanted to, I'll show you a couple of examples later on, but if you wanted to, say, have a ninja that was hanging on the side of a building, and he's holding on with both hands, and at some point during the animation, or say during gameplay, through an event trigger, you might have him just kind of drop his hand and let the underlying animation kind of take over. So he's just kind of swinging his hands around. You can basically script those weightages, or you can keyframe them as well. So what's really cool is the fact that all these constraints, they evaluate at runtime. You can keyframe your constraints, so you can keyframe like your IK targets for foot placement, but you're not limited to just keyframing them, either in an animation clip or in timeline. You can dynamically change these things. So, for example, you could have your IK be affected by raycast onto the ground. You could have, in VR, for example, you could have an IK chain for the hand, and have the IK target basically be driven by the position of your controller in space. So these are the rig constraints that we ship with. We are working on more, and actually I'll point out another one in I think the next slide. So these are a bunch of really cool constraints. I'll go through some of them after this, but basically these in combination allow you to do quite a lot of really creative things with just with things like twist bones for deformation corrections. If you need characters to interact with the world or each other, these are really powerful. So say IK for, I don't know, two characters doing a high five or shaking their hands, grabbing onto the wall and like kind of climbing up. And with something like with the damped transform constraint, you can do things like having sort of physics type motion. And the override transforms allow you to actually drive a skeleton with another skeleton, or drive a rig with another set of objects. So we aren't running this workshop at Unite, but we did run a workshop at SIGGRAPH earlier this year. The workshop content, including the sort of like the guide to follow along all the steps, is available on GitHub. I'll flash the URL again at the end. But one of the things that the workshop also covers is adding custom constraints. So there is a scripting portion where we added I think it was a chain. It was a chain constraint. So you can basically take these constraints and these rigs. You can combine them all together to create a full body, basically a full body rig for a character. And there are some really cool examples of all this. Now, one of the big advantages of having this runtime rigging system is that your animations can potentially be a lot more memory efficient than, for example, having an animator take a character, doing a bunch of, having a rig in Maya, for example. You got your IK constraints, you've got all your twist bones, all of your corrective shapes. But then bringing it back into Unity, into an engine, means you're still keyframing everything. So you've now got a bunch of keyframes on what really should just be keyframing an IK constraint, an IK target. So what this means is that for an IK target in runtime rigging, all you're doing is keyframing that one target, and the entire ARM chain follows along with it. So that means, and in fact, you can get even further, and you don't need to key that IK target because you can control that at runtime. Again, with two controllers for your VR, like a VR experience. Let me see. So these are a few examples that Andy Touch put together for, based on some of Dave's work. And so all of these guys, actually I'll switch over to the video because. So all of these guys are actually running the same base idle animation, like all of them. The same idle animation, they all just have override rigs. And these were all done basically as layers in the animator state machine. So you've got your rig override, you've got a finger pose. You just add on layers using these rigs. So you could, and it's flexible enough that you could key all of the all of your constraints as well as your bones at in the same clip. But in this case, you're kind of using, you don't really want it to necessarily touch the underlying animation clip from the SPX. So you take that, you add your constraints, and then you keyframe those constraints. So you can see quite a lot of variation here. You got this guy holding, his sword with a two-handed grip. You can move these keyframes at runtime. And everything kind of updates. You got this guy who's eating ramen. He's tired from running around everywhere and cutting people up. So he's eating some ramen. Again, this is just a handful of constraints. Again, with the same underlying idle animation. So it's there's a lot of cool things you can do. The next guy up is the climbing guy. So this guy, again, same idle animation. So over here, his left hand has no weight on the IK target. Now he's got some weight, and he's grabbing onto the pole. So once you drop the weight to 0, he's basically running his underlying idle animation. And this guy actually has no keyframes at all. He's just got a parent constraint for his IK hand target, and it's parented to his head with an offset. So there's no actual animation there's no actual keyframes other than the underlying idle animation. So he's just kind of looking around. So some really, really cool, just very cool stuff that you can do with this. So setting up a full body character rig, what we kind of like to do is try to organize things in logical sections. So for example, because a full character rig is going to be fairly complicated, it's a lot of things going on, you might split your rig up into different sections, logical sections, arms, spine, legs. If you wanted to, you could split it up, you can kind of break that down even further. So perhaps you might have another sort of section for your head if you have some facial controls, or maybe you got a finger layer as well. And because, again, everything is, like every rig has its own weight value, you can blend these in and out at any point in time. So here's an example of an arm setup. So you've got a 2-bone IK. We currently only ship with a chain IK and a 2-bone IK setup. I believe we're working on some more, but it's also extensible, completely extensible. So you want to build like a fabric IK, for example, you could do that. So the 2-bone IK for this arm, you'll notice we basically define a root, a mid bone, and a tip. Now the cool thing is that because it's not relying on chain length, you'll notice here that his forearm and his upper arm are actually split into 2 bones. That's for the twist correction. So this basically, those 2 bones, those 2 pairs of bones act as 1 bone each. So you get, you're not basically doing like a 4-bone IK chain. You're still doing a 2-bone chain with 2 sort of like compound bones. Now, the other cool thing is the effector display. These are really useful. So similarly to the bone renderer, we have something where you can just pick these targets. These are generally going to be empty game objects with components on them. So having these effectors makes it a lot easier to pick them. They're a lot cleaner than having gizmos, like your standard icon gizmos, because they are customizable. You can use, we ship with, I think, about 5 different effector shapes. I think there's like a cross and a box and a sphere. I think there's 2 others. But you can use anything. So if you wanted to use a form-fitting mesh so that, your hand effector is actually, the shape of the hand, or it's like the entire arm. You could basically do that. And of course, you can color code them. Sorry, I missed the. So you've got the hand target over here, and then there's that ball effector over there is basically the IK hint for pointing the middle bone. So here it is in motion. So you just grab that, move it around. Everything just updates. It's quite magical. Your leg region, this is actually a really cool setup. I think Dave put this one together. It's a little different from like a typical like reverse foot sort of setup, but in a way it's kind of cleaner, it's kind of simpler. So all you're doing is the multi-referential constraint allows you to essentially sort of dummy parent an object to another object. So we basically have sort of like these remote pivots, and those are the ball effectors at the base of his feet. You got one at the heel, one at the ball of his foot, one of it at his toes. And what that allows you to do is basically you can rotate the foot by the ankle, the heel, ball of the foot, or the toe at any point in time. I'll show you a demo of that later. Then there's, so you can use a sort of more of a prefab workflow to make duplicating stuff a little easier. Getting stuff mirrored from the left to the right. You can just set it up once, make a prefab out of that, switch that over, and kind of retarget your bones. And because the effectors are completely customizable visually, you could probably set up left and right leg to have different colors, like red, green, or you could go a step further and like different characters could have different color schemes. One's got red, green, one's, I don't know, blue, purple, something. So it makes it really clean and a lot more sensible to kind of start picking things out of the scene. So here's a little video of the foot setup. So you can see you're just kind of moving the foot around. and then you switch the driving object over to the toe. Now you're rotating the foot around the toe. And then you switch that over to the heel, and then you just pick up his foot from the heel. It's a really cool setup. And it doesn't take much work, because it's literally just putting that constraint on and just referencing the correct objects. So you could do like, yeah, your foot placement stuff, your, standing on tiptoes without having to do like counter animation and stuff. So then the spine region is a bit more going on here. So you got your center of gravity. So this circle over here is basically, it's something you'd be familiar with in like a Maya rig. You got a circle that you can grab and you can rotate this. So that's his entire spine being parented to that. The pelvis is pretty cool because it's using the multi-ref constraint, and that kind of allows you to have an animator pose the upper body and still affect the hips or the pelvis without affecting the upper body's pose. So you're not going to like rotate the pivot, his pelvis, and like the guy's going to go this way. He's just going to like rotate like that. Then the torso is cool. So I mentioned at the workshop, one of the steps in the workshop was to build a twist chain, and this basically is used for the spine. So basically, you give bottom and top, or start and end, and the rotation and basically the rotation will be distributed along the chain. And what's cool is that it's driven by a curve, like an animation curve. So it's not like a straight linear thing. You could be straight linear, but you can change up that curve so that you can have a little more control over how things bend. And the head, again, there's also a twist chain so that you turn the head and the neck kind of gradually turns along with it. So you can see that, a little bit of that in action over here. So you can see as you're changing the animation curve for the weight distribution, you're changing up how the curvature is distributed along that chain of bones. So then you got your spine override rig. So this kind of allows you to take again, like an underlying animation, have that play, but also offset that animation. So you can have an idle, and you can sort of do an override rig to keep that idle going, but also kind of turn his body, or kind of fiddle with his feet or legs. So essentially, you set that up by having essentially a duplicate hierarchy or partial hierarchy, and keyframing those duplicates. So you can see some of the constraints here, your IK constraints. The guy on the right is using a spine override and override transform for his spine. So you can see both of them are actually on the same animation, but this guy has some additional sort of sway. One of the things that Dave kind of put together to sort of eat your own dog food is last year for Hack Week, he put together a little mini game with a ninja, of course, and he was test driving a bunch of these constraints in order to build certain systems for a fully runtime, basically a fully runtime rig. So things like walk job. Actually, I'll show you the video. So all of these, a bunch of this stuff was basically done with runtime rigging. The way he's swinging his sword was set up as an aim constraint with a target that was kind of off in the distance and keyed to rotate. So it's a lot easier to get like a really nice proper swing, especially when you got sword trails. That butterfly that's following him around is done with the damped transform constraint. So as he's walking along or running along, the butterfly just kind of lags behind a bit and then catches up. Similarly, the, the sword, his katana, when he's swinging up and down, he's kind of swinging in different directions. So he's got full control over the direction of his swing, as well as the direction of where he's throwing his shurikens. So all those were done basically with a combination of aim constraints and blend animation so that you get the pose correct. Here we've got a Skeletal Deformation Rig, basically your twist bones. So you get nicer deformations on your twist. We don't like set up the twist bones. You still need to have you still need to have two bones in your forearm, your upper arm. But once those are done, you just kind of set those up as a twist constraint, constraint. So here's that vertical aim. So essentially allows you to aim up, aim down, just throw that thing anywhere you want. Because really, if you're a ninja, you're gonna be able to throw that thing pretty accurately. So we have basically a bunch of vertical bones, virtual bones, which are, well, they're just objects with rig transform components. And the rig transforms are really just a way for basically for the graph to evaluate, to include those objects in the evaluation. Then the vertical aim rig. So you got a 2-bone IK, and then the blend tree to make sure the pose is correct. Similarly with the katana, sort of a very similar setup, but if you're trying to animate like a big swing, it can be tricky to do a very smooth arc on the same plane sometimes, especially when you've got an arm that's kind of twisting here and there. So what this does is it just aims at an object that just gets rotated around an origin. So you get super smooth swings. And the butterfly familiar, which is a damped transform with a multi-aim, so that the guy is always lit up. So I believe the damp transform originally was set up as, basically you get sort of fake physics going on. You have pouches that are dangling, and they kind of follow along and kind of swing a bit. So this was kind of an interesting use case where he's using it as a gameplay element for something that follows along at a more natural pace than just sort of like being locked to him. Now, one of the things that I've noticed quite a lot of people have been asking, both at some of Dave's talks and maybe on the forums as well, is whether, because a lot of the examples that we've shown are basically humanoid. You've got the ninja. I think there was an ogre or something. So a lot of the questions are, can we do something that's non-humanoid? And that's absolutely possible. So this was done by our technical animator in Copenhagen, Yang Hai. And this one's really interesting because this does not use any keyframes. It's basically completely driven by user input. So basically your WASD keys, left, right, up, down. Your up, down basically changes the distance of this crane arm, the length that it extends, and the left, right basically just rotates the entire structure. You can see that it looks pretty natural. You got this big container. It's sort of lagging along because it's really heavy. There's a lot of inertia and momentum. It swings a bit as you sort of push back and forth because there's a hinge. But really, all this is done purely with animation rigging stuff. There's an underlying control rig that's not shown in this video, but there's an underlying control rig that is driven by the user input. So you push right, and the control rig moves along. The deformation rig, which is the one in green, is basically on a damp transform. It's a couple of IK chains on a damp transform. So they follow along, lag along behind, so there's that sense of inertia and momentum. Also, if you see the big piston connecting the two arms, Those are basically done with a combination of multi-aim constraints for the base and the two bases, and blend constraints for the intermediate sort of piston bits. So that's some really cool stuff. So here you can see a little bit of that the control rig versus that's supposed to be a video. But here you can see a bit of that, the control rig versus the actual deformation rig. There we go. So you can see the red arm is the control rig. The green arm is trying to catch up. And as you extend and retract the arm, you can see the container kind of swinging a little bit. No, that's not the right slide. It is the right slide. So in 19.2, we added the ability to keyframe your constraints in the animation window. Pop open the animation window, you hit preview. You can actually just go to preview mode. You don't need to key anything. And as you move stuff around, you move your IK constraints around. You can see the rig update in your editor. Then you can kind of keyframe all of your stuff, keyframe your constraints, keyframe weightages. 19.3, we're introducing timeline support, so you can author more linear animations or more layered animations in a slightly more conducive fashion. So here we've got keyframing in the animation window. Just setting up all your arm targets, just moving them around. So it's really, really easy to set up new animations and override layers. For timeline, we have basically this. You can set up all of your animations, your rig animations, layer them up, combine, layer, do whatever you want. So it makes it really nice to kind of work with. You can also set up, it makes it a lot easier to set up also linear kind of animations, cinematics, cutscenes, that sort of thing. This is an example of using timeline for creating an animation, and I won't go through the whole thing, but you can kind of see going into record mode, checking stuff, scrubbing back and forth, adjusting keys. So it just makes it really easy to tweak animations as well. So right now he's just tweaking like the rear foot placement as he crouches down. Another example of non-human, well, it's humanoid-ish, but non-organic, rigs. So this is something I was playing around with at home. Just basically, it's basically a chicken leg. That's supposed to be a video as well, but it's basically a chicken leg, mech leg sort of thing, right? So all this was you can see everything in the keyframes. The only thing I'm keyframing here is the hip rotation as well as the IK targets for the feet. It's two IK chains overlapping, and the upper legs or the upper IK chain is just set up with a target that is a blend constraint that's set up about 50% between the foot and the root. So you get this automatic chicken leg movement. The other thing is, if you noticed earlier, there were a bunch of pistons on these legs. So those are just set up with aim constraints. So as the leg is animating, it's contracting, the pistons are kind of just pushing into each other and moving, rotating. So it's really quite cool to kind of play with. This I did yesterday because, this I did on Monday because one of my coworkers brought up suspensions and I couldn't get it out of my head. So I just built a little really, really simple, probably not very good suspension. But But this really took me sort of to give you an idea of how flexible and kind of how easy it is to use this thing. I spent, I think I want to say about an hour, hour and a half on this, but only 5 to 10 minutes of it was setting up the rig. The rest of it was looking up videos of suspensions and trying to figure out what was going on there. So the actual rig itself took about 5, 10 minutes. And then I built most of this stuff out of like Unity primitives, see cylinders and boxes. So it's really, really quite flexible and quite easy to set up. Let's see if I can remember. We've got 2 aim constraints for the bones, for the spring basically, pointing at each other. I think an aim constraint for the 2 arms, and then both of them are basically just pointing at the wheel as it moves up and down. So super flexible, super simple to set up. And what's also cool is that there's no actual skeletal animation. It's not a skinned mesh renderer. This is just a bunch of primitives with a particular hierarchy so that I can get the rotation done right. Interestingly enough, you don't even actually need to have the pivots done correctly. It helps. But if your hierarchy of objects doesn't have the pivot correct, you can just sort of add pivots using the multi-parent or multi-referential constraints. So that's really cool. You just add something and just add a pivot. So if you have like I don't know, contrived example, you have a door asset that you got off of like the asset store, and its pivot is for some reason right in the middle of the door, and you want to do that. So you can just add a pivot to it using the multi-ref constraint, or with a parent constraint as well. Before I go to the last slide, I'm going to just show you this running in the editor. I need to duplicate. Okay, great. So these are some of the examples that you saw in the video earlier. But yeah, you can basically go in. You don't need to keyframe anything necessarily. And you can have all this stuff just driving, being driven by player input. Okay, I don't know why it's trying to import this FBX. Okay, so this can be driven by player input. Right now there are keyframes on this thing, I believe. So you can just kind of move things around. You can have this driven, again, like I said, you can have this sort of thing as, sort of a VR setup. You have the hands, the hand targets, basically being driven by your controllers in VR. You've got your head constraint, your chain constraint over here for your head. So you can see whoa, turned the head a bit too far. But you can see his neck kind of blending that rotation, so you get a nice soft rotation. I don't have to worry about turning the head, turning the neck a little bit. And I'll show you these guys. So again, I really like the effectors because you can just pick these empty game objects. But I can move this staff around, and it just sort of follows. He's just standing there. If I move his hand around, oops. I can't move his hand around because it's keyed right now. But I can move this around, and it just stays like rooted to the ground until I pull it too far. But it kind of stays rooted to the ground, which is really cool. Then you've got Dave's favorite, which is the ramen guy. Just eating that ramen. But you can see over here, the idle animation is actually just a read-only clip, which is basically what is driving the underlying animation. And then you just got the ramen posing and the finger pose, which is just a single keyframe. It just, so he's holding those chopsticks. Now we switch over to curved mode and we find his left target. So I can grab this. I can just kind of move them up and down. And it continues on. And I can turn the weight off. And he's just back to his, his original idle animation. Like, it's pretty nuts, the kind of stuff that you can do here. There's the climbing guy. Once again, I can take his control rig, turn the weight down. He's just standing there. And let's see. So here's that suspension. So here's that suspension thing. So I can be in play mode. I'm going to delete both of these. And I can take this wheel, which is basically the target for the swing arms. I just move them around. So obviously I haven't done this correctly as a suspension. You can see all this stuff moving around, but you can see the middle part of the piston also kind of blending between the two. So you could basically drive this entire rig, like the wheel and everything, by physics, for example, or by by animation, or by some other form of input. And last bit, whoops. And that last bit was the digitigrade leg setup. So similarly, I can just go over to animation, just preview that. So you can see these little pistons. They're all just kind of working just magically. They're just aiming at each other, really. So that's pretty much all I have for this. And if anybody has any questions, So if anybody has any questions, let me flash up the last slide with it. There was a. Yeah. So there's a couple links. We want to hear any feedback that you have after playing around with this thing, or even just from this talk. Please feel free to check out the workshop package or the workshop repo. There's a lot of really cool stuff in there, including sort of basically all the workshop steps as a PDF. So you can walk through how the Ninja rig was set up, as well as how to create your own custom constraints. So probably got like a minute for questions. So anybody? Yep.
So that looks great. The workflows that you have are all inside of Unity, where in reality we use a little bit of Unity and Maya or Max.
Correct.
So do you have ways of importing control rigs from Maya, or more importantly, exporting the control rig animation so further refinement or animation can be done outside? So
in a way, exporting the control rig like keys, that's doable just by the FBX like round trip stuff, or FBX exporter. So you can export the keys. We don't yet have sort of a way to bake down the control rig to like a keyframe animation to then export, but that's coming. I spoke to Dave, and he did mention that they're working on something like that. So because that also sort of is a use case for like games or something, where you don't necessarily, on lower end machines, you don't necessarily want like a full control rig running all the time. So for those, we are working on something to actually bake out the control rigs. Bringing constraints in is something I've been thinking about as well, and it's definitely doable. It's just a matter of how we map things. We do have a certain number of constraints that we take in from FBX files. I think we have like a built-in like aim constraint, position constraint. So those actually do map over. I haven't tested that sort of workflow, but we do support FBX constraints. So, but more complex control rigs would probably need. It's something that I've been thinking about, trying to get certain types of constraints or rigs at least partially mapped over to the animation rigging package. All right, if there's no other questions, thank you.